Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but what happens when the earth itself begins to tremble, when the past refuses to stay silent, clawing its way back into the light? In the cold winds of Little Thistle, there is a story that doesn't just haunt those who hear it, but those who dare to tell it. This isn't just about a crime long forgotten, it's about a shadow that still lingers, waiting, watching. And once you begin to listen, there is no turning back. The morning fog slithered through the narrow veins of Little Thistle like a silent predator, thick and smothering, coiling through the cobbled streets and seeping into the cracks of ancient stone cottages. It clung hungrily to the ivy that curled up the weather-worn walls, its tendrils winding like grasping fingers over forgotten gravestones. The dampness in the air was not just the kind that settled in bones, it carried a weight, a knowing chill, as though the very village exhaled a breath laden with secrets. The only movement came from the reluctant wisps of smoke escaping tight-lipped chimneys, curling upward hesitantly as if fearing to be seen. At first glance, Little Thistle wore the mask of tranquility, its lazy lanes weaving through slumbering cottages, their sagging roofs bending under the burden of time. But the silence here was not peace, it was a pause, a held breath, the hush before the first note of a dark symphony. A carriage emerged from the mist, its wheels grinding against the dampened earth, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the heavy stillness. The horse, a chestnut mare with a stark white blaze, moved with the careful deliberation of a creature that knew these paths too well, as if aware of the past they carried. At the reins sat an aging driver, his gaze locked ahead, unreadable yet oddly tense, a man who understood that the past never truly remained buried. Inside the carriage, Miss Jane Marple sat in composed stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She was unassuming, the kind of woman overlooked by those too absorbed in their own affairs, but her mind was a machine built for observation. The arching entrance to the village loomed ahead, and as they passed beneath it, she caught sight of a tilted wooden sign, the Little Thistle Tea Room. A woman stood in its doorway, adjusting the sign with trembling fingers. The movement was slight, but it was enough. Miss Marple's gaze lingered, and a quiet knowing flickered in her expression. The carriage did not stop. It would not need to. She would find her way back soon enough. The tea room, a snug wood-framed establishment, radiated warmth, its golden glow spilling onto the cobblestones. The scent of brewed tea and fresh scones floated into the air, a deceptive comfort layered over something unseen, something stirring beneath the surface. Inside, the hum of voices was low but charged, the weight of unspoken words pressing against the walls. Miss Marple chose her seat carefully, settling by the window with her back to the wall, ensuring her view encompassed every corner of the room. The porcelain teapot before her was delicate, its handle worn smooth by years of use. She had no intention of drinking yet, she was listening, watching. The tea room's proprietor, a woman with a practiced smile and sharp, knowing eyes, approached with a politeness that did not reach her expression. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. What can I get for you today?" "Just tea, thank you," came the measured response, quiet yet firm. Silence often invited more truth than questions. The murmured conversations around her became a low thrum of unease. Villagers spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with something heavier than gossip. "Trial," a whisper curled into the air. "Collingwood," another voice murmured, barely audible. "Wyndham, dirty business, that." The soft clink of cutlery punctuated the words. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her thoughts tightening around familiar names. Captain Edward Collingwood, Major Charles Wyndham. A murder trial that had left deep, unsettled fractures in this sleepy village. The villagers weren't discussing the trial itself anymore. No, their hushed voices held something darker, the echoes of what still remained unsaid. Beneath the surface of their cautious words and guarded glances, something else lurked, something waiting. Miss Marple had always known mysteries were never about what was spoken. They lived in the spaces between words, the details unnoticed by most, and here, in the little thistle tea-room, among steaming cups and deceptive warmth, the first thread of a deeper, far more dangerous truth had just begun to unravel. The mist lay heavy over Ashwick Hollow, not drifting, but clinging, as if the village itself exhaled secrets into the air, and refused to let them go. It slithered between the timber-framed houses, pooled in the alleys, and curled around the wrought-iron street lamps like spectral fingers, unwilling to release their grip. The cobblestone paths, damp with morning dew, bore no footprints, no signs of life beyond the occasional flicker of movement behind lace-draped windows. Even the chimneys, which belched hesitant wisps of smoke, seemed reluctant to disturb the hush that settled over the town like a held breath. At first glance, Ashwick Hollow appeared tranquil, an image of bygone charm, its thatched roofs sagging under centuries of unspoken stories. But silence, Miss Eleanor Graves knew, was rarely peaceful. It was a warning, a hush before the storm. She sat stiff-backed in a horse-drawn carriage, its wheels rattling over the uneven stones, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. A woman of modest stature, Eleanor possessed the kind of presence that turned even the most inattentive eyes toward her. There was nothing particularly striking about her, no sharp angles to her features, no dramatic elegance in her posture, but the weight of her gaze, the way she watched the world rather than simply existing within it, made her impossible to ignore. As the carriage passed beneath a weathered stone archway, her eyes flicked toward a crooked wooden sign that read, "The Hollow Hearth." A tea-room, unremarkable to most, yet to Eleanor, it was the heartbeat of the village, the quiet nucleus where whispers converged into something tangible. Outside, a woman adjusted the sign, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she tightened the worn leather strap that held it in place. A small, almost imperceptible thing, yet Eleanor noticed. She always noticed. The driver did not pause, nor did she request him to. The tea-room would wait, it always did. The past, however, was far less patient. When the carriage halted before the inn, Eleanor stepped down, her boots landing softly on the damp earth. The scent of wood smoke and rain clung to the air. Above, the sky hung in a perpetual shade of dusk, despite the early hour, as though the heavens themselves conspired to smother Ashwick Hollow in perpetual twilight. The innkeeper, a thick-set man with deep-set eyes, greeted her with the kind of wariness reserved for strangers who knew too much. "Miss Graves," he murmured, stepping aside to let her in. "You're expected." Of course she was. The news of her arrival would have slithered through the village before her carriage had even crossed the bridge. She stepped inside, into warmth, into the scent of damp wool and aging wood. A fire crackled in the hearth, yet did little to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. The tea-room, she decided, would be her next destination. If there was a pulse to this mystery, a place where the truth lay hidden beneath layers of pleasantries and well-worn rituals, it was there. The tea-room was, by all appearances, quaint, a relic of a slower time. Lace curtains framed fogged windows, and the air was thick with the aroma of steeped leaves and warm bread. Yet beneath its surface there was something else, something Eleanor could sense in the wary glances exchanged between villagers, in the way conversations tapered into silence as she entered. She chose a table near the window, back to the wall, where she could observe without being observed. The proprietor, a woman with sharp eyes and a carefully curated air of welcome, approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her gaze. "Good morning, Miss Graves," she said, voice light but brittle. "A pot of Darjeeling, I presume?" Eleanor inclined her head. The woman disappeared behind the counter, but her hands, oh her hands, twitched at her sides. Nervous, holding something back. Eleanor had encountered enough deception in her lifetime to recognize it when she saw it. The quiet hum of the tea-room settled around her, but her attention snagged on fragments of murmured conversation drifting from a nearby table. "The trial," a voice whispered, hoarse and wary, "Collingwood." A second voice, edged with unease, "Wyndham." the clink of cutlery, the scrape of a chair. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the porcelain handle of her cup. Names familiar yet distant, like echoes from a dream. Captain Edward Collingwood, Major Charles Wyndham, a trial that had left scars on this village, deeper than the ones visible. The past was pressing against the present, clawing its way through time. Eleanor took a sip of her tea, cold now, but it was never about the tea, it was about what came next. The courtroom was a beast of its own, a grand brooding space where truth and deception wove themselves together so tightly that at times it was impossible to tell them apart. Heavy oak panels lined the walls, their rich polish dulled by time and the weight of history. High above, chandeliers flickered, their light casting restless shadows that danced across the faces of those gathered. The air was thick, not just with the scent of old parchment and wax-polished wood, but with something unseen, something suffocating, like the quiet before a storm. At the center of it all sat Captain Alistair Harrow, his back ramrod straight, his hands folded with practiced precision, his face a careful mask of indifference. His uniform, though crisp, seemed almost too pristine, as though it had been prepared for a different occasion, one where medals gleamed and accolades were whispered, rather than a trial where accusations cut through the air like a sharpened blade. Across from him, the prosecution stood poised, their lead counsel, Victor Holloway, exuding the confidence of a man who already knew the ending to this story. "Tell the court," Holloway began, his voice smooth as oil yet carrying the weight of a hammer, "what happened on the night of December 14th, 5 years ago." The witness, an aged soldier with a face carved by war and eyes shadowed by memory, hesitated just long enough for the room to tense. Then, in a voice rough with the grit of old ghosts, he spoke. "We were ordered to clear the outpost. No survivors, that's what we were told. We expected a routine mission. We were wrong." A hush fell over the courtroom, every ear straining to catch each syllable, each breath between words. The soldier's gaze flickered briefly to Harrow, but there was something there, something hesitant, something unwilling. Eleanor Wakefield, seated in the farthest row of the gallery, noticed it immediately, a slight twitch of the man's fingers, the way his throat bobbed, dry and reluctant, fear, not of telling the truth, but of something else entirely. She'd spent years unraveling lies, dismantling facades, and she knew the difference between guilt and terror, and this was terror. "Go on," Holloway pressed. The soldier swallowed, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand as though it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the present. "We secured the perimeter, moved inside," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "There were civilians." He stopped. His breath hitched. One of them was just a boy. The tension in the room shifted, took on a new weight, a collective invisible tightening of shoulders, a stiffening of spines. And what happened to the boy? Holloway's question was simple, but it sliced through the air like a scalpel. The soldier looked down, a long pause. "Captain Harrow gave the order," he said finally, voice hoarse, "not to take him in, not to question, just," his throat worked around the word, "eliminate." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like the first tremor before an earthquake. Harrow remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but Eleanor caught it, the briefest flicker of something behind his eyes. Not guilt, not even anger, calculation. He was watching, waiting, measuring every reaction. Holloway leaned in, pressing the moment like a blade against soft flesh. "So you're saying," he said, voice steady, deliberate, "that Captain Harrow executed a child?" The silence was deafening, and then finally, "Yes." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. Something wasn't right. The story was too clean, too perfectly damning. The soldier's words were spoken with conviction, but his body betrayed him. This was rehearsed, fed to him, and yet the horror in his eyes was real. He wasn't lying. He was drowning in the weight of a lie given to him. The gavel struck once. "Order," barked the judge. but the damage had been done. The courtroom had transformed from a place of law into something far older, something primal. A colosseum, where men were judged not by truth, but by the weight of the whispers around them. Harrow turned his head slightly, just enough that his gaze found Eleanor in the gallery. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't plead. He simply held her gaze, steady and knowing. She had seen enough trials to recognize a condemned man, and she had seen enough deception to recognize when the noose was being placed by the wrong hands. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom was a crucible, its walls steeped in history and heavy with the ghosts of past verdicts. The scent of old paper, polished wood, and the faint trace of cologne clung to the air like an unseen mist. But beneath it all lay something far more potent, the quiet hum of concealed truths waiting to be unearthed. At the center of it sat Colonel Elias Mercer, his posture straight, hands folded in front of him, but there was no mistaking the exhaustion behind his steel-gray eyes. A man like him had spent years on the battlefield, not just in war but in the wars that followed, wars of silence, of memory, of reckoning. Now those wars had followed him here. Across the room the prosecutor, a lean man with an almost surgical precision to his demeanor, placed a single photograph on the polished wooden table, the faded edges curled ever so slightly, the ink worn by time, yet the image itself carried a weight that threatened to tip the scales of justice before another word was spoken. Two men, younger then, yet their eyes held the shadows of the battles they had fought. Mercer and Major Stephen Calhoun, side by side in uniform, their expressions unreadable, at least to the untrained eye, but there was something there, something unsaid, lingering beneath the surface. This photograph, the prosecutor began, his voice cutting through the charged silence like the first crack of thunder. Before a storm was taken in the weeks leading up to the operation at Black Hollow, a mission that, as history tells us, ended in disaster, a shift rippled through the room, an almost imperceptible tightening of shoulders, a collective breath held just a moment longer than necessary. Black Hollow, the name alone was enough to turn whispers to silence. A mission scrubbed from official records, buried beneath layers of conflicting reports and missing files. A mission that had left an entire village in ashes. The prosecutor took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Mercer like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "Colonel, would you care to tell the court what really happened that night?" Mercer didn't move at first. The lines on his face, carved deep by time and consequence, remained unreadable, and yet something flickered behind his gaze, something Miss Eleanor Vale, seated quietly in the gallery, did not miss. She had spent her life unraveling lies, and she recognized the look of a man standing at the precipice of truth and survival. "It was a tactical decision," Mercer finally said, his voice even but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "The intelligence we received indicated an insurgent stronghold. We acted accordingly." "Acted accordingly?" The prosecutor echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Accordingly would imply precision, Colonel. It would imply strategy. But what we know is that there were no confirmed combatants found among the remains, only civilians, women, children." A murmur swept through the courtroom like dry leaves caught in an autumn wind. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "War is never clean," he said at last. "You expect neat lines, clear distinctions, but the reality is much different. Decisions are made in the moment, with the information at hand." "A convenient answer," the prosecutor remarked, "especially given that the sole surviving witness of that night tells a very different story." Another shift in the room, a new name whispered among the crowd. A survivor. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the small notebook in her lap. She had followed the trial from the beginning, knowing there was something beyond what was being presented. And now, at last, the thread had been pulled. A witness, proof, but more importantly, danger. Mercer did not react, but the stillness of his form betrayed him. He had expected this. He had known it would come. And yet the look in his eyes told Eleanor that it wasn't the truth that terrified him, it was something else. Someone else. The judge's gavel struck once, calling for order, but the storm had already begun to brew. And Eleanor, ever the observer, knew one thing for certain: this trial was not about justice, it was about control. About silencing the past before it could tear free. But secrets had a way of clawing their way to the surface, no matter how deeply they were buried. And she intended to follow them, no matter where they led. Lost in the shuffle of lawyers and journalists, Eleanor Vale moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridor, the click of her heels drowned by the murmur of voices echoing from the courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood, a weighty silence settling over her like dust on forgotten files. This trial was not about justice, that much was clear. It was a performance, a carefully orchestrated illusion designed to hide a truth far darker than mere murder. As she stepped into the cool night air, the city roared around her, its endless movement a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness inside the courthouse. But Eleanor had learned long ago that the loudest distractions often concealed the most damning secrets. She pulled her coat tighter, her sharp eyes scanning the flickering street lamps, her mind already piecing together the tangled threads of a conspiracy buried beneath years of silence. Her destination was Black Hollow Manor, a relic of another era, standing like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of town. The road to the estate wound through a landscape that seemed to darken with each passing mile, the skeletal branches of old oak trees clawing at the sky like accusing fingers. The iron gates, once formidable, now stood rusted and weary, creaking open at the slightest touch. The house loomed beyond, its stone walls scarred by time, windows staring blankly like the empty eyes of a corpse. It had been abandoned for years, left to rot along with the secrets its walls held. Yet as Eleanor approached, a single lantern flickered in the upstairs window, proof that ghosts weren't the only ones haunting this place. The heavy door groaned in protest as she pushed it open, stepping into the cavernous hall where time had been reduced to dust and silence. Chandeliers draped in cobwebs swayed slightly in the draught, their crystals dull beneath layers of neglect. The scent of mildew clung to the walls, mixing with something far more unsettling, something metallic, something that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps, though the only tracks in the dust were fresh. Someone had been here recently, someone who had no intention of being found. Eleanor moved through the shadows with practiced ease, her gloved fingers tracing the cold wood of the banister as she climbed. The study door was ajar, a sliver of flickering candlelight spilling into the hallway. She stepped inside, and the room seemed to exhale around her, the air thick with secrets waiting to be unearthed. Maps and old military files littered the desk, their edges curled and stained with time. A single photograph lay at the center, 4 men in uniform, their eyes shadowed by something no camera could capture. One of them was Colonel Elias Mercer, the man standing trial, the others, they were ghosts now. But it wasn't the photograph that sent a chill through Eleanor's veins. It was the dark stain on the rug just beneath the desk, the unmistakable scent of dried blood lingering beneath layers of dust. Someone had died here, and someone had tried to erase it. A sudden creak echoed from the hallway. Eleanor turned sharply, every muscle coiled in quiet anticipation. The trial had begun in the courtroom, but the real battle was being fought here, in the darkness of Black Hollow Manor. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, but Eleanor Vale had never been one to let the past rest in peace. The dust on the bookshelf trembled as Eleanor Vale traced her fingers over the worn spines, each volume whispering a story of wars fought and lives lost, histories penned by victors, truths buried with the dead. The room was a museum of memories, but it was the desk that called to her, an island of order in a sea of neglect. A small wooden box sat at its edge, unassuming yet deliberate, as though left there not by accident, but by a hand that had hesitated at the last moment. She opened it, the rusted hinge groaning under the weight of time, revealing only a stack of brittle letters and a faded black and white photograph. Two young men stared back at her from another era, their uniforms pressed, their expressions hardened by the weight of what they had seen. One was General Ashford Rothwell, the man whose trial had gripped the city in whispers and scandal. The other, Colonel Desmond Hale, was long dead, his name spoken only in hushed conversations and buried official reports. But Eleanor wasn't interested in old photographs. It was the locked safe beneath the desk that sent a chill through her veins. The scratches around its keyhole told a familiar story. Someone had tried to break in and they had failed. Eleanor moved with precise efficiency, sifting through drawers, sliding her hands along the underside of shelves, until her fingertips brushed against something metallic beneath a stack of forgotten reports. The brass key was small, dulled with age, but when she slid it into the safe's lock, it turned smoothly. The door swung open, revealing a sparse collection of documents, an old military medal and a single folded letter, yellowed, the edges worn soft by time. She unfolded it carefully, her breath steady as her eyes scanned the ink-scrawled message. The operation is buried. The truth of Blackthorn Ridge must remain untold. We all have blood on our hands, but silence is the only way forward. You know what must be done. D.H. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Blackthorn Ridge. The name had been erased from every official record, but whispers of it had lived on among the few who knew what had happened there. A betrayal, a massacre, a truth so damning it had been wiped from history. But history had a habit of resurfacing in the most unexpected places. She set the letter down, her gaze shifting back to the photograph. Rothwell and Hale, standing side by side, their futures still unwritten. But time had done its work, turning one into a man on trial, and the other into a ghost. Eleanor had spent enough years chasing the past to know that ghosts never rested easily. The trial wasn't about justice, it was about containment, about ensuring that the sins of Blackthorn Ridge never saw the light of day, and someone somewhere was still willing to kill to keep them buried. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. Eleanor's pulse spiked, her fingers hovering just above the letter. Someone was here. The air in the room seemed to tighten, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing in around her. Carefully, silently, she folded the letter, slipping it into her coat pocket. The game had shifted. This was no longer about uncovering the past, it was about surviving the present. And Eleanor Vale had never been one to let the past win. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch Eleanor Vale as she moved through the house, their hollow eyes filled with secrets they would never share. She had seen too many men carve their legacies into history, only to have the truth of their actions buried beneath layers of dust and deception. The house was a mausoleum of forgotten whispers, its silence heavy with things unsaid. Her steps were light, precise, as she traced the corridor, absorbing the scent of aged wood and something else. Something faint, like the lingering ghost of a crime. She found the study almost by accident, a room hidden behind a heavy bookcase, its entrance slightly ajar. The hinges let out a soft groan as she pushed the door open, revealing a space untouched by time. The dust lay thick, the furniture cast in dim shadows from the grime-coated windows. Papers were scattered across the desk, some neatly stacked, others seemingly abandoned mid-thought. Letters from war companions, court summons, and most intriguingly, a photograph. Two men in military uniforms, younger, their faces hard but not yet unbreakable. General Everett Langley, the man at the center of the scandal. The other, Colonel Simon Wren, long dead, his name erased from official records but never from history's memory. But it was the letter beneath the photograph that sent a slow chill through her veins. She unfolded it, the ink faded but the message clear. We agreed, silence was our only shield. If you dig, they will bury you. Walk away while you can.
Solve.
Eleanor's fingers tightened around the paper. Silence had been their currency, and someone had paid dearly to keep their end of the bargain. She let out a slow breath, her mind already piecing together the implications. This wasn't just about a trial, it was about something much deeper, something clawing its way up from the past. A floorboard creaked. She turned sharply, her hand instinctively drifting toward the pocket where she kept her blade. In the doorway stood a man, his silhouette ragged against the dim light of the corridor. His coat was worn, his posture heavy with years of unspoken knowledge. A beard obscured half his face, but his eyes, sharp, restless, spoke of a man who had seen too much and lived too long with it. "I know what you're looking for," he murmured, his voice rough with an accent she couldn't quite place. Eleanor didn't move, her expression carefully blank. She had seen men like him before, watchers, the ones who lived in the margins of stories they would never tell. "I'm simply taking in the atmosphere," she replied, her voice light but distant. The man stepped further into the room, his boots dragging against the floor. "I saw the visitor," he said, voice lower now, as if even the walls had ears. "The one who came on the night Langley died. He walked the grounds like a shadow, thought he was a ghost at first." Eleanor's pulse remained steady, though her mind raced, a shadow at the scene of the crime. Unseen, unnoticed, the kind of figure who existed only in the spaces between truth and fiction. "A ghost?" she echoed, tilting her head slightly. The man nodded, glancing over his shoulder, as if afraid something might be lurking just beyond the door. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? About Langley's past. They called him the Butcher of Blackmere for a reason. That man was steeped in blood, and everyone knew it. So when someone comes sniffing around, asking questions, well, things don't end well. Not here, not in this house." Eleanor inhaled slowly. The words were meant to rattle her, but she had spent too long chasing shadows to be frightened by them. Fear wasn't in the ghost stories, it was in the details, in the half-truths people whispered when they thought no one was listening. "You didn't answer my question," she said, her gaze steady. "What exactly did you see?" The man hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. "Not much," he admitted, voice unsteady now. "Just a shape, a figure moving between the trees. I'm not saying it was Wren, but, well, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it comes back to finish what it started." Eleanor offered a polite smile, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. The past didn't return on its own. Someone had to dig it up, and whoever had walked the grounds that night had come back to make sure that some secrets stayed buried for good. The man turned abruptly, disappearing down the hallway as quickly as he had appeared. Eleanor remained still for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. Then, with deliberate care, she folded the letter and slipped it into her coat. The game had changed, and she wasn't about to play by their rules. A cold wind whispered against the ancient stones of the manor, as if the night itself was guarding a secret. Miss Eleanor Graves pulled her long overcoat tighter around herself and pushed open the heavy teakwood door, which let out a low, mournful creak. Inside, the study was shrouded in darkness, with only the faint glow of moonlight casting pale streaks across the dusty shelves and forgotten papers. Everything in the room felt lifeless, frozen in time, but Eleanor knew that every dried ink stain, every scattered page, held a story that had led to someone's death. Her fingers brushed against the brittle edges of an old letter, tracing the words with quiet reverence. "You broke the promise. Now only the darkness will bear witness." Each word was a locked door, and Eleanor had made it her life's mission to find the keys. Beside the letter lay a faded photograph. Two men stood side by side, one clad in a trench coat, the other adorned in a uniform heavy with medals. Their smiles were empty, their eyes sharp and unreadable, filled with the weight of something unspoken. She had barely begun to process the implications when the door groaned open again. A shadow flickered in the dim light. "You came looking for it, didn't you?" The voice was low, unsteady, carrying the tremor of a secret too heavy to bear. A man stood at the threshold, his face lined with exhaustion, his eyes clouded with something between fear and regret. Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead she offered a calm, knowing smile. "I'm only looking for the truth." The man hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place belongs to those who can forget. You should forget too." But forgetting had never been an option for Eleanor. She met his gaze, searching for the truths his lips refused to speak. "Someone saw something that night, didn't they?" A thick silence settled between them, stretching into the shadows. Then at last his eyes darkened with the weight of memory. "A shadow," he murmured. "I only saw a shadow." Eleanor's pulse quickened. That shadow had not been a mere trick of the night. It was the lingering ghost of a buried truth, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. But for now, it remained in the dark. The air inside the tavern was thick with the scent of aged wood and spilled whiskey, a haze of murmured conversations filling the dimly lit space. Miss Eleanor Graves sat across from the man, her gaze steady, unrelenting. He had looked at her for a long moment, his eyes flickering with nerves, yet sharp with calculation. He hadn't expected her to approach him so directly, hadn't decided yet whether to engage or withdraw. But Eleanor was not one to let a fish slip the hook. "You knew Warwick, didn't you?" Her voice was just above a whisper, designed to pry without drawing attention. The man, Harry Coyle, shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the glass in front of him, his silence stretched, thickening like a storm cloud. "He was a hard man," Harry finally muttered, his voice strained, as if the words fought their way out. "Kept things too close, too damn close." "And Lawson?" Eleanor pressed, watching the flicker in his expression, a tell subtle but there. "He was your commanding officer, wasn't he?" Harry exhaled slowly, his shoulders stiffening. He cast a wary glance over his shoulder, his instinct for caution refusing to die, even now. "Lawson, he was different, more of a soldier's soldier. No interest in the politics, just the fight." Eleanor studied him, the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them. Not much room for thinking, was there? Harry's head snapped up, startled, as though she had peeled back a layer he hadn't meant to expose. His next words came softer, barely above a breath. "No, there wasn't. There it was, the truth, bleeding out like an old wound reopened. Warwick and Lawson, two men bound by war long after the last shot had been fired. The battle had not just claimed lives, it had taken pieces of them, pieces that could never be given back." Eleanor left the tavern soon after, her mind heavy with the weight of what she had just learned. These men, these veterans, had endured the same horrors, yet each bore his scars differently. Some had been shattered by the past, others had buried it beneath layers of silence, but the past had a way of clawing its way back. The village library was a quiet sanctuary by the time she arrived, the scent of old paper and dust hanging thick in the cool air. She moved through the narrow aisles, her fingers trailing over leather-bound spines, searching for something, anything that could connect the present to the past. The trial had unearthed many things, but not everything. There were still gaps in the story, pieces that refused to fit. At a worn wooden desk, Eleanor pored over an aged military record book, its pages yellowed, ink faded in places. Names, dates, operations. She traced Warwick and Lawson's movements through the war, each new discovery weaving a clearer picture. The pieces were aligning. Just a few more connections, and she would have it. Then she found it, a mention of a covert operation, its details quietly buried beneath bureaucratic ink. Eleanor's finger hovered over a name that had never come up in the trial, but should have. Her pulse quickened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows of the library. She recognized him, one of Lawson's old soldiers. He approached her with a tense expression, his eyes betraying the weight of a burden too heavy to carry alone. Without a word, he slipped something into her hand, a crumpled piece of paper, folded and worn. "Don't mention this," he whispered, his voice edged with something close to fear. "The past never stays buried, but maybe it should." Eleanor unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the hastily scribbled words. "The night of the murder, the anniversary of Verin. You're not the only one who remembers." Her breath stilled, the weight of it settled deep in her chest. The timing wasn't an accident. Someone had ensured it happened then. She looked up, meeting the soldier's gaze. There was regret there, but also something else, something darker. He knew too much. And now so did she. As she stepped out into the night, the village seemed quieter than before. The shadows stretched deeper, darker, pressing against the edges of her consciousness. This wasn't just a case of murder, this was retribution, and the strings of the past were tangled so tightly, even she wasn't sure who was pulling them. But she would find out. One thread at a time, the dim glow of a single desk lamp flickered over the cluttered corkboard, casting long wavering shadows over the scraps of newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and hastily scribbled notes pinned in a chaotic pattern, each piece a fragment of a story still untold. Eleanor Graves stood motionless before it, her arms folded, her sharp gaze absorbing the tangle of connections like an intricate web stretching beyond sight. The murder, the buried war crimes, the trial, they weren't separate events, not anymore. The names, the places, the dates threaded together, weaving a picture so faint it was like tracing the outline of a ghost. She exhaled, stepping closer, her fingertips lightly tracing the brittle edge of a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Brigadier Warwick found dead in country estate, homicide investigation ongoing." The words were cold, indifferent. But behind them lay a story someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Her gaze shifted downward, to a black and white photograph of two men in uniform, Warwick and Lawson standing shoulder to shoulder, their expressions hardened by war, secrets buried deep in their guarded stares. The past clung to them, refusing to die, and now it had bled into the present. Beneath the photo, another scrap of paper bore only a name, Verin, a single word, yet it carried the weight of something far heavier, a secret buried with the dead. The quiet creak of a door broke the silence. Eleanor turned, unshaken, as the innkeeper hesitated in the doorway, a small wrapped parcel in his weathered hands. "This came for you," he murmured, voice low. "Thought you'd want it." She took it, fingers careful as she unwrapped the coarse brown paper. Inside, a bundle of letters, old but well preserved. Most were mundane, personal correspondences, but one stood out, a single sheet, its ink faded but its words still sharp. "You will keep your promise. If not, I will speak, and when I speak, the truth will be worse than death. Remember Verin." Eleanor's pulse quickened. The past was clawing its way to the surface. Warwick and Lawson had tried to bury something tied to a night long ago, but someone else had remembered, and now someone had made sure it would not stay forgotten. Her next step was clear. The past didn't exist in records alone, it lived in the men who had survived it. The tavern was thick with the scent of stale beer and old wood, a haze of smoke clinging to the rafters. Veterans gathered in their usual corners, hunched over their drinks, their voices low, guarded. They had fought in the same wars, lived through the same horrors, but time had turned them into relics, men who carried the past like an anchor, too heavy to cast aside. Eleanor's gaze found him near the fire. Charles, once a soldier, now just another forgotten man. His frame had withered with age, shoulders bent under the weight of memories he refused to share. She slid into the seat across from him, her voice measured. "It's been a while, Charles." He barely glanced at her, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Not long enough." She let the silence stretch, watching the flicker in his eyes before she leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to pierce through the noise. "You were there, weren't you? At Varen. His hand froze mid-motion, his jaw clenched, and for a moment the firelight caught in his glass, reflecting something dark in his stare. Warwick. Lawson. Varan. The past had never died, and now neither would the truth. The old soldier's hands trembled as he lifted his glass, his weathered fingers tightening around it like a man clutching a fading memory. Warwick, he muttered, voice thick with something unspoken. Always hiding behind his rank, always playing the game. He took a slow sip, his eyes shadowed by the flickering glow of the tavern's dying fire. But Lawson was different. A soldier's soldier, they said. Disciplined, unyielding, but even he had his demons. Eleanor Graves leaned in slightly, her expression unreadable. She echoed, her voice a thread in the heavy silence between them. Charles exhaled, staring past her, lost in something only he could see. They didn't just follow orders, he whispered. No, not like the others. They chose who died. His words were clipped, bitter, carrying the weight of a truth that had long festered in the dark. Eleanor nodded, absorbing the revelation. Choosing who died, that wasn't war. That was something else entirely. She left the tavern soon after, the cold night air tightening around her as she walked, each step firm, deliberate. She had names now, pieces of a past that refused to stay buried. But she needed more. The local records office smelled of dust and aging paper, a mausoleum of forgotten histories. The clerk, a nervous man with darting eyes, handed over the files she requested with hands that shook just enough to betray his unease. Was it fear, or was it something deeper? She sifted through the brittle pages, her eyes sharp, methodical, and then, there it was. A report, wartime, its ink faded, but its meaning stark, a mission that had gone wrong. The details were scrubbed clean, redacted until only two names remained, Warwick and Lawson, the rest, erased, hidden. But why? Eleanor's fingers hovered over the words stamped across the top of the page, Varan. It wasn't just a place, it was a secret, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed that way. The sun was setting when she stepped onto the empty street, the dying light bleeding over the rooftops like the last embers of a fire. The truth was near. She could feel it tightening around her, threading through the whispers, the missing pieces. But so was the danger. She had pushed too far to turn back now. That night, the village was wrapped in silence, the kind that felt too still, too complete. The inn greeted her with its own hush, the fog pressing thick against the windows, curling along the dimly lit corridors. Eleanor welcomed it. Solitude gave her space to think, to separate the truth from the carefully laid misdirections. She locked the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the room's emptiness. The corkboard stood before her, a battlefield of names, dates, photographs. The pieces were scattered, methodical, but she knew better than to trust their neatness. The truth was never orderly. Some of these clues were weapons, others were traps. The question was, who had set them? She leaned forward, tracing the unseen connections, the silent language buried between inked lines and aged photographs. The murder, so simple, so clean, or so it had seemed. But now, the more she studied it, the more she saw the unseen threads twisting through the events, forming a web. A carefully spun web, meant to ensnare not just the victim, but anyone who came too close. Earlier that day, she had walked the estate where Warwick had died. The ground had been dry, the night air still, but the locals had whispered of a figure moving through the dark, a shadow glimpsed at the edge of sight. No one had seen a face. No one could agree on who it had been. Some said a stranger, some said the wind playing tricks. Eleanor Graves did not believe in tricks. The past was not finished, and neither was she. The answer had never been in the shadows of the estate, nor in the whispers of the frightened villagers. It was buried in the details, in the quiet inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed. The so-called mysterious visitor had been nothing more than a smokescreen, a distraction designed to mislead. No, this was no accident, no unfortunate coincidence. The timing was too precise, the method too deliberate. Someone had orchestrated this, not just as an act of murder but as part of something far deeper, a story that stretched back further than anyone dared to acknowledge. As Eleanor Graves studied the crime board before her, her fingers brushed against the edges of a sepia-toned photograph, a young Henry Mercer, flanked by two other men in military uniforms. One of them was Samuel Hartley, the man now standing trial for Mercer's murder. The other, his name had been stripped from the record. Her eyes traced the familiar pattern, a timeline stretching back to the war, each event connected by an invisible thread, leading toward a name she had only begun to decipher: Blackwood. The name had surfaced repeatedly, spoken in hushed tones, scrawled in old documents, hidden within personal letters that had somehow survived the years. A battlefield had once borne that name, a battle few dared to recall. Mercer and Hartley had both been there, so had others, men whose names had been conveniently erased, buried beneath redacted reports and misplaced files. The truth was being suppressed, suffocated beneath layers of deception, but someone had made a mistake. The date of Mercer's murder had not been random. It had aligned perfectly with the anniversary of the Blackwood incident, a classified operation that had ended in silence and sealed files. Eleanor had spent days piecing together scraps of information, and now the picture was finally taking shape. This was not vengeance, nor was it the simple unraveling of an old feud. It was a reckoning. Someone had decided the past could no longer remain buried, and Mercer's death was just the beginning. The unease in the village had been growing, the weight of old sins pressing down on those who had survived the war. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder were now divided by fear, their loyalty tested by secrets they had vowed to carry to their graves. And yet, the past had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. As she pulled another report from her desk, her eyes narrowed on the ink-smudged signature at the bottom. T. Blackwood, the enigmatic figure who had lingered on the edges of every account, always present, yet never fully named. Eleanor knew that whoever this person was, they were the architect of everything, the whispers, the misdirections, the murder itself. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Had Blackwood orchestrated this from the shadows, or had Mercer's own guilt sealed his fate? The evening stretched long, the candlelight flickering against the walls as Eleanor turned back to the board. The pieces had fallen into place, the web tightening with each new revelation, but she knew that solving the mystery was only half the battle. The confrontation was coming, the moment where the truth would be forced into the light, where every lie would unravel before the eyes of those who had fought to keep it hidden. Outside, the wind howled through the village streets, rattling the old wooden signs, carrying with it the echoes of a history no one wanted to relive. But the past did not care for silence. The past demanded to be heard, and when the truth finally came to light, it would shake everything to its core. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the letter in her hand. This was not just about justice, it was about revealing a truth that had long been denied, a truth that once uncovered would change everything. The hall was suffocating in its silence, the air thick with anticipation as soldiers lined the walls, their faces unreadable, their postures rigid with the kind of discipline that masked unease. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing at the center of it all, Eleanor Graves, unwavering, composed, her fingers resting lightly against the podium. In the dim glow of the overhead lamps, she looked almost statuesque, the only movement in the room the slow, deliberate rise and fall of her breath. No one spoke, not even the legal representatives seated at the front, their hands folded neatly on the polished wooden table, their expressions impassive. But the weight of the moment pressed down hardest on one man alone, Captain Julian Ashford. He sat toward the back, his spine rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed straight ahead, yet never truly focusing. He had been summoned, commanded to return to the place he had long abandoned, to sit and listen as his past was unearthed before an audience too afraid to confront its own ghosts. A clock on the far wall ticked, each second stretching impossibly long before Eleanor finally spoke. "I thank you all for gathering," she said, her voice soft yet sharp, a blade concealed within velvet. "What is said in this room today is not mere speculation. It is truth, unforgiving, irrefutable." A hush settled, a collective inhalation held just beneath the surface, as she took a step forward. "We are not here to discuss just a murder. We are here to unravel a reckoning years in the making." The words landed like stones against glass. Julian did not move. Eleanor turned to the chalkboard at her side, already marked with a meticulous sequence of dates, places, events, a timeline that did not simply tell a story, but exposed it. She picked up a worn photograph, lifting it for all to see. The image was yellowed at the edges, but the figures in it remained unmistakable. 3 men in uniform, younger, untouched by time, their expressions frozen in a moment that had long since decayed. "Blackridge," she said, the name slicing through the silence. A battle they called it, a campaign, a mission, but what happened there was none of those things. A shift in the room, someone cleared their throat, others avoided looking directly at the photo. Eleanor placed it down, her gaze never wavering. The truth was buried beneath misfiled reports and sealed testimonies. But the past does not stay buried, no matter how many names are redacted from history. Her fingers brushed the ink-stained letter on the desk beside her. Julian Ashford and Colonel Edmund Wren stood together on that battlefield. Orders were given, orders were carried out. But there was a third man that day, a man whose name has been whispered in the corners of every testimony I've collected. A man who disappeared into the shadows the moment the blood dried. She turned to the board, circling a date in sharp, deliberate strokes. And it is no coincidence that on the anniversary of that betrayal, Colonel Wren was found dead. The tension in the room deepened, tightening like a noose. Someone shifted in their chair. Julian remained perfectly still. Eleanor's voice softened, but the edge in it did not waver. This was not just a murder, it was a message. A reminder that silence does not absolve guilt. She let the words settle before continuing, her tone now almost contemplative. But who delivered that message, and why now? Her eyes scanned the room, reading every twitch of discomfort, every flicker of concealed recognition. Then she turned to Julian Ashford, the weight of her gaze pressing down like a hand against his chest. "Perhaps the better question is, what is it that you fear most, Captain? The truth, or the moment it finally catches up with you?" A muscle in Julian's jaw tightened. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, carrying with it the distant echoes of something long forgotten. But inside, within the suffocating walls of the hall, the past had found its way home. And it was demanding to be heard. The air in the grand hall was thick, not just with the scent of polished wood and aging parchment, but with the silent weight of withheld truths. Soldiers lined the walls, their expressions frozen in the kind of neutrality that only masked deeper unease. The legal representatives sat still as statues at the long table, their hands folded, their eyes betraying nothing. But Eleanor Graves saw beyond the stillness. She saw the calculations, the suppressed anxieties, the tension coiled beneath the surface like a wire ready to snap. And she saw him, Captain Julian Ashford, his posture stiff, his fingers clenched so tightly against his knee that the knuckles stood out in stark relief. His eyes, however, were the giveaway. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but she knew his mind was moving quickly, threading together the scattered details, struggling to form a picture that still eluded him. But Eleanor wasn't fooled. She had seen men like him before, men who spent their lives outrunning their own ghosts, only to find themselves cornered when the past finally caught up. She stepped forward, her voice measured but sharp enough to slice through the stillness. "It was you, wasn't it, Captain Ashford?" she said, her tone devoid of accusation but heavy with certainty. You needed Colonel Wren to face the consequences of his actions. You needed him to answer for what happened at Blackridge. The hall seemed to shrink around them, the silence becoming almost unbearable. Ashford did not flinch, but Eleanor caught the briefest flicker in his expression, a muscle tightening at his jaw, a whisper of something that had not been there before, doubt, fear, a ghost of an old regret. She took another step toward him, and the room held its breath. But what you failed to consider, she continued, her voice lower now, sharper, was that you were not the only one with a reason to see him dead. There were others who have carried their own grievances, their own wounds, buried beneath the weight of silence. She turned her gaze across the room, sweeping over the watchful eyes of the gathered soldiers, the officials, the few civilians who had come to witness what could not be undone. You were all complicit, she said, and the weight of those words pressed down like a stone, perhaps not in the act itself, but in what led to it. You turned a blind eye, you let the past rot, let the truth fester until it could no longer be contained. She turned back to Ashford. The flicker of tension in his posture was almost imperceptible, but she saw it. The question is not just who killed Colonel Wren, she said, her voice now a quiet blade, but why now? Why, after all these years, did this reckoning have to take place? The room held its collective breath. No one dared move. Eleanor let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle into the bones of everyone present. Then she turned to the board where the timeline of events was meticulously laid out. Blackridge, she said, her finger tracing the name written in bold strokes. A covert operation, a betrayal, an order carried out under the pretense of necessity. She picked up the photograph from the table, holding it up so that all could see. Two men stood side by side, years younger, untouched by time, their faces betraying no knowledge of what was to come. Captain Ashford and Colonel Wren, she murmured. Bound by duty, divided by a choice. She placed the photo down, her eyes scanning the room once more. This murder was not an act of vengeance, she said. It was a message, a confrontation with a past that refused to stay buried. She let the words settle before taking a final step forward. But here is what you must understand, this does not end with Wren's death. The past does not die so easily, and neither do the secrets buried with it. A gust of wind rattled against the windows, a distant storm brewing on the horizon. Inside, however, another storm had already begun. The air in the dimly lit chamber crackled with unspoken tensions, every breath a held whisper, every gaze a careful calculation. Miss Evelyn Carrow stood at the heart of it all, her sharp eyes locked onto the man who had, until this very moment, masked his unease beneath a veil of rigid decorum. You knew this day would come, didn't you, Colonel Harding? She said, her voice barely above a murmur, yet slicing through the hush like a finely honed blade. Harding's jaw twitched, a muscle in his temple tightening, but he remained silent. The others in the room, high-ranking officials, weary-eyed veterans, a few determined journalists shifted uneasily in their seats, the weight of revelation pressing down upon them like a gathering storm. Miss Carrow took a measured step toward the long oak table where pieces of evidence lay arranged with surgical precision, a tattered letter, an old service revolver, a faded photograph marked with smudges of time. We have all heard the official account, she continued, glancing briefly at the document pinned to the board behind her, a neatly typed report that now seemed little more than a well-crafted lie. Major Blackwell died in an act of bravery, defending his post until the last breath. That is the story we've been told, but the truth, she let the word linger, heavy, suffocating, is that Major Blackwell never stood a chance. He was silenced before he could speak, and it was you, Colonel, who ensured that silence would last. A murmur rippled through the room, a mixture of disbelief and grim recognition. Harding's fingers curled against the edge of his chair, his carefully composed expression betraying the first flicker of something deeper, an unraveling. Miss Carrow pressed on, unrelenting. He was going to expose it, wasn't he? The covert operation in Greyfield, the orders that were never supposed to exist, the men who were never meant to return. A single drop of rain hit the window pane, a whisper of the storm building outside, as if the very elements conspired to echo the turmoil unfolding within. Harding's eyes darkened, the flicker of defiance warring with the inevitable. "You see, Colonel," she said, lowering her voice, her words laced with quiet certainty, "the past does not stay buried. It lingers, it festers, and when the time is right, it demands to be heard." The room held its breath. The web of secrets had unraveled at last, and now there was nothing left but the truth, raw, undeniable, and utterly inescapable. The room was suffocating with the weight of its own silence, an oppressive stillness that clung to every breath, every furtive glance exchanged beneath the flickering light of the chandeliers. Inspector Alistair Graves stood unmoving at the center of it all, his fingers clasped behind his back, his sharp gaze dissecting the man before him, Lord Eversley, a figure who, until tonight, had carried himself with the unshakable certainty of a man untouchable. But that certainty was unraveling. His spine, once stiff with practiced dignity, now bore the unmistakable hunch of a man whose sins had finally caught up with him. The others in the hall, noblemen, officers, widows who had buried more than just their husbands, watched in a mixture of dread and anticipation as though bearing witness to the precise moment a man's past turned against him. "You knew," Graves murmured, his voice like the crack of a distant storm. "You always knew this day would come, didn't you?" Lord Eversley exhaled, slow and measured. But it was not a breath of relief. It was the deep, bone-deep exhalation of a man who could feel the noose tightening. His lips barely parted, a flicker of a word nearly escaping, but then he swallowed it back, his gaze flickering toward the others in the room, as though searching for a single sympathetic face. There were none. The cold, unyielding hush did not waver. Blackmore was never meant to survive, Graves continued, stepping forward, his boots clicking against the polished wood like the ticking of an unseen clock. The official record claims he fell in battle, a hero, a man who met his end with dignity. But that isn't the truth, is it? A single murmur rippled through the hall, a restrained shudder in the air, like the intake of breath before a scream. Eversley's fingers curled against the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white, but he did not deny it. He did not even flinch. "It was a secret you buried for 20 years. But the dead don't stay buried, my lord." Graves tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something more than just revelation, something closer to grim satisfaction. "The past waits. It waits until it is ready to drag you back down with it." The words landed like a stone into still water, rippling outwards, breaking apart the delicate web of silence that had held the room in its grip. The others shifted in their seats, eyes darting, breaths held too long. A lady in mourning black let out an almost imperceptible gasp. The officers among them, men who had built their careers on duty and sacrifice, seemed to shrink under the weight of knowing they had sat at the same table as a traitor. Blackmore uncovered what he was never meant to see. Graves pressed on, his voice tightening, sharpening. "And you silenced him before he could expose the truth, a truth that would have destroyed you, stripped you of your title, your lands, your legacy. But more than that, it would have revealed the betrayal that ran through your veins like poison." A muscle in Eversley's jaw twitched. Graves saw it, the fracture, the hairline crack in the porcelain mask. He had seen men stand before the gallows with less fear than what now flickered behind Eversley's hollowed eyes. "You had him executed," Graves said, his voice barely more than a whisper now, but the weight of it crashed through the room with all the force of a cannon blast. A quiet death, one with no ceremony, no dignity, just a final breath stolen in the dark. The silence was absolute. The world outside the manor might as well have ceased to exist. Graves let the moment stretch, let the unbearable stillness press against the walls, against the ribs of everyone present, until the truth itself felt like a living thing in the room, something breathing, something undeniable. Lord Eversley closed his eyes for the briefest of moments, a flicker, a quiet, unspoken surrender. The past had caught up at last, and the weight of it was his alone to bear. A hush had settled over the village, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but laden with an unspoken weight, a tension that coiled beneath the surface like a taut wire waiting to snap. The truth had been unearthed, yet the unease that followed felt even more suffocating than the lies that had come before it. The air was thick with something intangible, a mixture of fear and reckoning, as if the very ground beneath their feet was trembling under the burden of long-buried secrets clawing their way into the light. The dawn was slow to rise, the sky bleeding into pale grey, as if the world itself was reluctant to acknowledge the aftermath of the revelations that had shattered the illusion of peace. Inside their homes, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the villagers whispered, their voices hushed but urgent, the echoes of betrayal clinging to the wooden beams of their centuries-old houses. Some spoke in anger, others in disbelief, but all of them with the same gnawing realization that the past, no matter how deeply buried, would always demand its due. By the time the morning sun finally broke through, casting its hesitant glow over the cobbled streets, the courthouse had become the heart of the storm. The heavy doors groaned as they swung open, spilling out a flood of spectators, their expressions shadowed with the weight of what they had just witnessed inside. The trial itself had been swift. There had been no need for prolonged deliberation, when the confession had been as undeniable as the crime itself, but what lingered in the air was the far more damning specter of the broader investigation, the questions that no one wanted to ask but could no longer ignore. The village square, once a place of quiet routine, had transformed into something else entirely, a stage where the past and present collided in a chaotic dance of suspicion and guilt. Soldiers who had once marched in unison now stood apart, their gazes wary, their loyalty fractured by the knowledge of what had been hidden for so long. Reporters jotted down notes in frantic scribbles, their pens scratching against paper like nails against stone, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding scandal. Miss Harriet Vale watched it all with an expression unreadable, standing just outside the courthouse steps, her gloved hands clasped before her as the murmurs of the crowd swirled around her like the cold wind that threatened to carry their words away. She had been here before, seen the way people recoiled from the truth even as they demanded it, how the weight of knowledge was often heavier than the bliss of ignorance. She could see it now, in the downcast eyes of those who had fought to keep the truth buried, in the trembling hands of those who had never wanted to know. But the past was never content to stay silent, and now that it had found its voice, it would not be silenced again. As the whispers grew, stretching out across the village like cracks forming in fragile glass, Harriet knew this was only the beginning. The ripples of the revelation would spread far beyond this place, beyond these people, and for those who thought they had finally outrun their sins, the shadows of their past were already closing in. The courtroom was thick with an air of inevitability, the kind that settled in when justice was no longer a question but a foregone conclusion. Captain Arthur Lennox sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of composure that barely concealed the storm raging beneath. His hands were still, but his fingers curled slightly, as if resisting the urge to grasp at something, control, perhaps, or the illusion that the past could be rewritten. The judge's voice droned. The prosecution laid out its case with mechanical precision, and witness after witness took the stand, each testimony hammering another nail into a coffin that had been built long before the trial even began. It was not the murder of Colonel Braithwaite that gripped the village now, it was what that crime had come to represent. The quiet betrayal woven into the fabric of history, the rot hidden beneath the polished veneer of medals and honor. Outside, the village square buzzed with an uneasy energy, the murmurs of townspeople blending with the rustling leaves of an encroaching autumn. The newspapers, ink barely dry, carried headlines that spoke of not just murder but a deeper conspiracy, a systematic deceit buried beneath decades of silence. Betrayal in Blackwood. Wartime Lies Unearthed. One read. Another, more ominous, simply declared, A Reckoning Begins. Miss Eleanor Harcourt sat toward the back of the courtroom, her gloved hands resting neatly in her lap, her sharp eyes missing nothing. To the rest of the onlookers, she was just another spectator, a relic of an older generation watching the slow march of justice. But she was more than that. She had seen the way history had been carefully rewritten, how men like Lennox and Braithwaite had sculpted their own legacies from the bones of forgotten soldiers. And now, finally, the thread had begun to unravel. Yet, even as the trial pressed forward, Eleanor knew this was only a surface wound, an incision into something far deeper and more dangerous. The inquiry that followed promised to be the real storm, the kind that could not be contained within the four walls of a courtroom. It was no longer just about one man's guilt, but the weight of an entire system built on secrecy and sacrifice. As the days stretched on, testimonies turned into confessions, and the names of men once thought untouchable surfaced in the ink of official records. Documents, long buried, now spoke louder than words. Soldiers returned to give accounts of missions they had been ordered to forget, and those who had once turned a blind eye were now forced to see the bloodstains on their own hands. The village itself seemed to shrink under the weight of its own ghosts. Conversations became hushed, old friends avoided each other's gazes, and shopkeepers carried out their business with a nervous efficiency, as if lingering too long might expose them to the contagion of truth. At the courthouse, the inquiry stretched into weeks, each day unraveling another layer of deception. What had begun as a simple murder trial had transformed into something far more consuming, a reckoning that threatened to pull even the innocent into its tide. By the time Eleanor stepped out into the crisp evening air one final time, the sun had already dipped below the rooftops, leaving only the fractured light of gas lamps to illuminate the streets. She paused, watching as the last of the reporters rushed to file their stories, their expressions alight with the thrill of scandal, but she felt no such satisfaction. The truth had been spoken, yes, but justice was not a thing easily won. The past did not disappear simply because it had been acknowledged. It lingered, settling into the cracks of a place like Blackwood, a place that had lived too long in the shadow of unspoken sins. And as Eleanor walked slowly away, her silhouette blending into the dim glow of the village, she knew that even though the trial was over, the echoes of what had been uncovered would never truly fade. The hush of the countryside was deceptive, a fragile veil stretched over the weight of all that had come before. Eleanor Harcourt stood at the edge of the woods, the wind carrying whispers of things best forgotten, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. The war had changed them all. It had broken some, hardened others, and left behind ghosts that clung to the village like ivy on old stone. Black Hollow had always been a quiet place, the sort of village where people spoke in careful tones, where history was tucked away behind closed doors. But now, with the trial over, the truth laid bare, the hush had taken on a different quality. It was no longer the quiet of routine but the silence that followed revelation, the stillness of a wound freshly cut. The trees swayed, their leaves stirring in restless murmurs, as if the forest itself remembered what the people wished to forget. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the softened earth, her mind picking over the last few weeks like a puzzle, whose edges had finally snapped into place. Captain Lennox had confessed, his voice steady but hollow, as if some part of him had already made peace with the gallows. The courtroom had held its breath as he spoke of orders given in the dead of night, of men who had never returned, of papers burned before they could bear witness. Yet Eleanor knew that justice, real justice, was not as simple as a trial and a sentence. The village was not cleansed by a single man's reckoning. The names of the truly powerful, the men who had orchestrated the betrayals from behind mahogany desks, would never be called to account. The war had left its stains on more than just history. It had settled into the very bones of Black Hollow, and no amount of time would scrub it clean. As she walked deeper into the woods, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of voices, No, not voices, echoes. She had heard them before, in the lingering gazes of soldiers who had returned, in the unspoken admissions that sat heavy between old friends. They were the echoes of men who had lived with secrets, who had carried the weight of duty and deception alike. Eleanor paused, pressing her palm against the rough bark of an old oak, the ridges biting into her skin. The inquiry had dragged into its second month, peeling back the layers of deception with every passing day. Documents had surfaced, fragments of old communications, coded missives that hinted at orders more sinister than anyone had dared admit. A name had surfaced, one that sent a ripple of unease through the village: Major Renford. He had left Black Hollow years ago, vanished into the machinery of war, but his presence lingered like a shadow cast long before the sun had set. There were those who whispered that he was dead, that justice had found him in some quiet unmarked grave. But Eleanor was not so certain. There were pieces missing, gaps in the story that no one seemed willing to fill. The villagers too had begun to change. The weight of the truth had settled over them in ways they hadn't expected. Conversations had become stilted, friendships strained. Some had welcomed the reckoning, had faced it with their shoulders squared. Others had shrunk beneath it, their smiles more forced, their laughter brittle. It was not the trial itself that had changed them, but the knowledge that the past could not be buried forever. The weight of their silence, their complicity, was now something they could not ignore. Eleanor turned, the wind brushing a lock of silvered hair across her cheek. The village lay beyond the trees, its rooftops barely visible in the gathering dusk. Soon the lights would flicker on, small beacons in the coming dark. Life would go on as it always did. The fields would still bloom in the spring, the market would still bustle with trade, but beneath the surface, the scars would remain. She exhaled, her breath curling in the cool air. The war had ended, but its echoes had not. They never truly did, and as she stepped back onto the path, her silhouette swallowed by the gathering twilight, she knew that somewhere, hidden deep in the quiet folds of history, another truth was waiting to be uncovered. The night air was cool, crisp, with the remnants of autumn, and carried with it the hushed murmurs of a village that had seen too much. Black Hollow stood in uneasy silence, its narrow streets still haunted by the echoes of what had come to light. Eleanor Harcourt walked with measured steps, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, the weight of revelation pressing against her ribs. The trial had ended, the verdict delivered, but the village had not been cleansed of its secrets. If anything, the truth had only made the shadows grow deeper. They all knew now, knew of the betrayals that had woven themselves into the very fabric of their town, of the men who had made choices no war could justify, of the names whispered behind closed doors that would never be written in history books. Justice, such as it was, had been served, but it had come too late for some. The past did not surrender easily. She passed the old stone well at the heart of the village square, its surface worn smooth by years of hands gripping the edge, seeking stability. It had been here long before the war, before the men who had come and gone, before the blood had been spilled. It would remain long after. The thought unsettled her. Things had changed, irrevocably so, but Black Hollow would carry on, as it always did, wrapping its wounds in silence and routine. But Eleanor knew that silence was never truly empty. It carried the weight of the unspoken, the unsaid, and tonight it felt heavier than ever. She glanced toward the old inn, its windows glowing with firelight, the only warmth in the cold night. Inside, voices murmured, glasses clinked, signs of life moving forward, but she had no illusions. Beneath the surface, people were still reckoning with the truth. Some had found vindication, others disgrace. A few had slipped away before the noose of consequence could tighten. Major Renford among them. His name had surfaced in the trial, a spectre lingering just beyond reach. Orders given in the dead of night, men who had vanished without a trace, a ledger that had conveniently gone missing in the final days of the war. There were gaps in the story, pieces that didn't quite fit. Eleanor had watched as the courtroom had turned its attention elsewhere, satisfied with the confessions they had extracted, but she was not so easily distracted. Justice, after all, was not just about the crimes already proven. It was about the ones still waiting in the dark. She had spent years learning the language of deceit, of half-truths spoken with steady voices. Renford was no ghost. He was alive somewhere, watching, waiting. A breeze stirred the trees along the road leading out of the village, their branches whispering like conspirators. Eleanor paused, listening to the night. Something was shifting, something just beyond her understanding. She had felt it before, in the days leading up to the trial, in the way the village had begun to pull apart at the seams. The past was not done with them, and neither was she. With one last glance at the inn, she turned toward the road, the path stretching out before her. The answers she sought lay ahead, in the places Black Hollow dared not look, and she would follow them, no matter where they led.